My parents' faith changed my life before I had any say in the matter. When I was just 4, they moved off to Nepal, convicted by the Bible that tells people that from those whom much is given, much is also required. My early years were spent wandering the foothills of Mount Everest around the small mission community hospital where my dad worked. And from quite an early age, I was taught the things of the gospel, and I was instructed in these things. And when I was about 7, I made my first step of faith, telling my mum I'd invited the Lord Jesus into my heart. However, although that was a good thing for the time, as I grew older, I was able to ask some deeper questions. And with those questions came doubts. And by around the age of 10, I was really questioning the existence of God at all. I wanted him to be there, but I couldn't be sure that he existed. This also coincided with quite an unsettled time in life, where we moved from that small village back to Australia for 15 months, and then went on returning to Nepal to the capital, Kathmandu. The time in Australia was particularly difficult, as I struggled to fit in and make friends, but I remember being quite glad when we actually had to leave again. Moving back to Kathmandu, it took a little while to settle, but I did actually start to make friends. But it wasn't until my second year there when some of these deep questions about faith and about God began to be answered. Throughout this time, I was crying out to God and praying that he would reveal himself to me if he was there. In that second year, I moved up to the older youth group, and I came across so many people who were passionate about their faith, and I really wanted to be like some of them. I remember just the atmosphere, the worship, as we gathered in that small living room, and the presence of God was almost tangible in some of those moments. I don't remember exactly what the talk was about, but I remember a few months in hearing a talk and being offered a chance to pray a prayer of recommitment and faith, and knowing at that moment that I was ready to pray that prayer. The biggest thing I remember in that period was just the way that the doubt and fear that had been so prevalent was replaced with joy and freedom. Life wasn't always easy, of course. The highs of the times at youth group didn't always translate through the challenges of adolescence and school and homework and all that comes along with it. But it was a time of growth and continued development of my Christian faith. The next big step for me was when I moved back to Australia for university. This was another challenging time, and particularly until I moved to university. When I did move on campus, I settled quicker than I dared hope, particularly given my previous experiences in Australia. And it was a time of great growth in my Christian faith. Some of the questions did surface a little bit again, particularly as some of my friends from high school stopped following Jesus. But God revealed himself to me in new and deeper ways, and I learned so much about the Bible and how it fits together as God's story. I had opportunities to share my faith, living in close quarters with 200 other college students, and I had opportunities to take some leadership in faith as well, and look out for newer Christians who are coming into the college. This was a wonderful time of Christian growth for me. It was also a time where I had many of my closest friends, and including my wife today. I wish I could say that after that time that it's been a continual journey of growth in Christian faith. But life isn't quite so simple. Yes, there's moments of growth, but there's been some challenges. The transition to work was hard, especially as so many of my friends moved far away. I myself went back to Nepal, moving far, for a year to teach, and later to Mount Isa, before moving on to Bible college. Even since then, as I've worked in a number of churches, my path hasn't been straightforward, and the growth hasn't been smooth. But I do know that God has been with me in those times. And I remember in one particular moment of challenge and crisis, being struck by the story of David, which I was preaching at the time, where he seems to be on the straightforward path to his destiny, to his kingship. He'd been anointed by the prophet. He killed the giant Goliath. He was popular among the people. He was the leader of the army. He'd even married the king's daughter. And it seems like everything was in place for God's plan to be fulfilled. And yet, instead of the straightforward path, he then spends years in the wilderness, fleeing for his life from the jealous King Saul. And yet, in this time of suffering and hardship, he wrote so many of the Psalms that we hold dear. And in this time, he embodies what it was to be the sort of king that Christ would later be. It's not the easy road that God always chooses. And I was encouraged that God still has plans and purposes for my life, even when things don't go as I might have planned. More and more, I'm struck by the fact that ultimately God's kingdom doesn't depend on me. It's not about my successes or failures, but about what God has done in the Lord Jesus for me and for the world. As the Apostle Paul writes, his grace is sufficient for me, for his power is made perfect in weakness.